I was sitting on my front porch in Scottsdale, Arizona, enjoying my Saturday morning coffee when I saw her marching up my driveway like she owned the place. Sharon Pritchard, the president of the Saguaro Heights Homeowners Association, was clutching a manila folder against her chest, her face already contorted into that pinched expression I'd come to dread over the past 6 months. Her heels clicked against the concrete with each purposeful step, and I knew whatever was coming wasn't going to be pleasant. "Carter Daniels," she announced before she'd even reached the porch steps. "We need to talk, immediately." I set my mug down on the wooden armrest and leaned back in my chair. "Morning to you too, Sharon. What seems to be the problem today?" She stopped at the bottom of the stairs, refusing to come up uninvited. The folder came away from her chest, and she opened it with theatrical precision. "The problem, Mr. Daniels, is that you have violated HOA regulations for the last time. Your continued defiance has left the board no choice but to take drastic action." Here we go again. In the 6 months since I'd moved into this neighborhood, Sharon had been on my case about everything imaginable. First, it was my mailbox being the wrong shade of beige. Then it was my grass being a 1/4 inch too tall on a Tuesday afternoon. Last month, she'd cited me for parking my work truck in my own driveway because it had my company logo on the side, which apparently violated some obscure commercial vehicle restriction buried in page 47 of the HOA bylaws. "What is it this time?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. "This time," her voice went up an octave, "this time, Mr. Daniels, you have 18 outstanding violations. 18. The fence you installed without approval, the unapproved paint color on your garage door, the decorative rocks in your front yard that exceed the maximum allowed stone size by 2 inches, your refusal to remove the bird feeder that attracts nuisance wildlife," and I could go on. I rubbed my temples. "Sharon, we've been through this. The fence was approved by the architectural committee. I have the email from Tom Henderson himself. The paint color is desert sand, which is literally on the approved color list. The rocks were here when I bought the house. And the bird feeder is attracting birds, not nuisance wildlife. That's kind of the point." Her expression didn't change. "The architectural committee's approval was rescinded when we discovered you'd begun installation before the mandatory 7-day waiting period. The paint color you used is desert sand from Sherman-Williams, not desert sand from Bayer, which is the approved brand. The rocks may have been installed by the previous owner, but you are now responsible for bringing the property into compliance. And the bird feeder has attracted squirrels, which are classified as nuisance wildlife per Section 12, subsection D of our bylaws." I stared at her. "You're joking." "I am not joking, Mr. Daniels. And frankly, your flippant attitude toward these serious matters is exactly why the board has been forced to take the action we're taking." She pulled a document from the folder with a flourish that would have been impressive if it weren't so infuriating. "As of today, the Saguaro Heights HOA is officially notifying you that we are seizing your property." The words hung in the air like a bad smell. I stood up slowly, coffee forgotten. "Excuse me. You heard me correctly. Due to your persistent and willful violations of HOA regulations, combined with unpaid fines totaling $8,300, the board has voted unanimously to seize your property. You have 30 days to vacate the premises." My heart was pounding now, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Sharon, HOAs can't just seize property. That's not how any of this works." She thrust the document toward me. "It's all outlined here. Section 43 of the bylaws clearly states that in cases of extreme and continued non-compliance, The association may take possession of the property to bring it into compliance and recover outstanding debts. I took the paper from her hand and scanned it quickly. It was typed on official Saguaro Heights HOA letterhead, complete with the board members' signatures at the bottom. Sharon Pritchard, President; Linda Weatherby, Vice President; George Hamilton, Treasurer. The language was dense and officious, full of whereas and heretofore, but the message was clear. They were claiming the authority to take my house. "This is insane," I said, looking up at her. "You can't do this. This isn't even legal." "I assure you it is entirely legal and proper. The bylaws are binding contracts that you agreed to when you purchased your property. You signed the acknowledgement of receipt and acceptance, Mr. Daniels. Ignorance is not a defense." "I'm not ignorant, Sharon. I'm telling you that HOAs don't have the legal authority to seize property. You can file a lien, sure. You can even foreclose on a property in some circumstances, but you can't just decide to take someone's house because they have the wrong bird feeder." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "The board has consulted with our attorney, and we have been assured that we are well within our rights. The 30-day notice period begins today. I suggest you use that time to make arrangements." She turned on her heel and marched back down the driveway before I could respond. I stood there holding the ridiculous document, my peaceful Saturday morning thoroughly destroyed. This had gone too far. Way too far. I went inside and immediately called my buddy Jake, who was a real estate attorney in Phoenix. He picked up on the third ring, sounding groggy. "Carter." "It's 8 in the morning on a Saturday, man. This better be good. Jake, I need legal advice. Like right now. My HOA just told me they're seizing my house." There was a pause. "They're what?" I explained the whole situation, from Sharon's arrival to the document she'd handed me. I could hear Jake moving around on the other end, probably getting out of bed and heading to his home office. "Okay, first things first," he said, his voice sharpening into lawyer mode. "HOAs absolutely cannot just seize property. That's not a thing. What they can do is file a lien for unpaid assessments or fines, and in Arizona, they can actually foreclose on that lien if the debt is significant enough, and they follow very specific legal procedures. But even then, they have to go through the courts. They can't just announce they're taking your house." That's what I told her, but she insisted they'd checked with their attorney and it was all legal. Then their attorney is either incompetent or she's lying about having consulted one. "Can you send me a picture of that document?" I snapped a photo and texted it to him. There was silence on the other end while he reviewed it. "Holy hell," Jake said finally. "This is actually kind of amazing. They've just completely made up a legal process. This section they're citing about seizing property for non-compliance. I'd bet money it doesn't exist in your actual CC and Articus. They've probably just written it into some amendment or board resolution and are pretending it has force of law. So what do I do? Well, you definitely don't move out. That's number one. If you abandon the property, you could actually create legal problems for yourself. Number two, you need to send them a response in writing, immediately, stating that you dispute their authority to take this action, and that you will not be vacating. Number three, you should probably get your own attorney involved, because this is quickly heading toward litigation territory. My stomach sank. How much is this going to cost me? Depends on how crazy they want to get. Look, let me make some calls on Monday. I've got a colleague who specializes in HOA disputes. In the meantime, document everything. Every interaction with them, every violation notice, every fine. And for God's sake, don't talk to Sharon or anyone else on that board without having it in writing or on recording. We talked for a few more minutes before I let him get back to his weekend. I spent the rest of the morning digging through my files, pulling out every piece of correspondence I'd had with the HOA. The pile was depressingly large. Sharon had sent me violation notices for things I didn't even know could be violations. One letter complained that my garbage cans were visible from the street on a non-collection day, even though it had been collection day, and the truck just hadn't come yet. Another cited me for having holiday lights up past January 15th, when I'd taken them down on January 12th, but there'd been a few strands tucked under the eaves that I'd missed. The fine notices were even worse. $25 per day for each violation, accumulating faster than I could address them. Some of the violations contradicted each other. I'd been fined for having a brown spot in my lawn due to insufficient watering, and then a week later fined for excessive water usage after I'd increased my irrigation schedule. By Sunday evening, I'd drafted a formal response letter. Jake had sent me a template, and I'd adapted it to my situation. The key points were clear. I disputed the HOA's authority to seize my property. I would not be vacating, and I demanded they provide the specific legal statute or case law that authorized their action. I also requested a full accounting of all fines and the basis for each violation, along with copies of the architectural committee's alleged rescission of approval for my fence. I hand-delivered the letter to Sharon's house on Monday morning before heading to work. She lived 3 streets over in a house that looked like it had been staged for a magazine shoot. Everything was perfect. The lawn was perfect. The flowers were perfect. Even her doormat looked like it had been professionally positioned. She answered the door in a pressed pantsuit, looking ready for a corporate board meeting despite it being 7 in the morning. "Mr. Daniels," she said coolly, "I'm surprised you're still here. I would have thought you'd be busy packing." I held out the envelope. "This is my formal response to your notice. I'm not going anywhere, and I suggest you and the board consult with an actual attorney about the legality of what you're attempting to do." She took the envelope without looking at it. "We have consulted with our attorney, as I told you." "Your response changes nothing." "Then I guess we'll see each other in court." Her eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening legal action against the HOA?" "I'm saying that if you continue down this path, you're going to force me to protect my rights through the legal system. This is your chance to back down before this gets expensive for everyone. The HOA has significant resources and legal support, Mr. Daniels. Do you really want to engage in a protracted legal battle with us? That seems foolish." I felt my temper rising but kept it in check. What seems foolish is an HOA president who thinks she can just take someone's house because she doesn't like their bird feeder. Read the letter, Sharon, and have a good day. I turned and walked back to my truck before she could respond. My hands were shaking slightly as I drove to my construction site. I'd started my own contracting business 2 years ago, and it was finally starting to take off. I had 3 projects running simultaneously and a waiting list of potential clients. The last thing I needed was this HOA nightmare draining my time, energy, and money. My foreman, Miguel, noticed something was wrong the moment I arrived at the job site. "Boss, you okay? You look stressed." I gave him the abbreviated version while we walked through the framing of a kitchen addition we were building for a client in Paradise Valley. Miguel had worked with me for 5 years, first when I was employed by a larger contractor, and then when I'd branched out on my own. "Man, that's crazy," he said, shaking his head. "My cousin had HOA problems in his neighborhood, but nothing like that. They tried to fine him for painting his house the wrong white. Like, white is white, you know. I wish that was my biggest problem right now. You need anything, boss?" "I can ask around, see if anyone knows a good lawyer or something." "I appreciate it, Miguel. I've got Jake looking into it. Just need to keep my head down and focus on work." That turned out to be harder than expected. Over the next week, things escalated rapidly. On Tuesday, I came home to find a large orange sticker on my front door declaring the property under HOA enforcement action. On Wednesday, Sharon sent me another letter, this one claiming that my refusal to comply with their seizure notice constituted trespassing on HOA-controlled property. On Thursday, 2 members of the architectural committee showed up unannounced and tried to inspect my backyard without permission. I'd been home for that one, thankfully. I heard them opening my side gate and went out to find them already 10 feet into my yard, clipboards in hand. "What are you doing?" I called out. Linda Weatherby, the vice president, looked up with a startled expression that quickly morphed into indignation. "We're conducting the required inspection pursuant to the enforcement action. You can't just come into my yard without permission. That's trespassing." George Hamilton, the treasurer, adjusted his glasses and consulted his clipboard. The bylaws grant the architectural committee right of access to all properties for inspection purposes. With reasonable notice and during reasonable hours, not by just letting yourselves in whenever you feel like it. Get out of my yard. Now. Linda's face flushed. "Mr. Daniels, your hostile attitude is not helping your situation." "My hostile attitude? You're in my yard without permission. How would you like it if I just walked into your house? That's completely different and you know it. Get out. Both of you. Right now, or I'm calling the police." They left, but not before Linda made a show of taking photos of my yard with her phone, documenting God knows what violations. I immediately called Jake and told him what happened. "They're panicking," he said. "That's actually good news for you. They're making sloppy moves, which means they know they don't have solid legal ground. My colleague, Rachel Morrison, has agreed to take your case. Can you meet with her tomorrow?" Rachel's office was in downtown Scottsdale, in one of those modern glass buildings that looked expensive just standing there. She was in her mid-40s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. We spent 2 hours going through everything, every document, every interaction, every fine. "This is one of the more egregious cases I've seen," she said finally, leaning back in her chair. "And I've seen some pretty bad HOA overreach. The good news is that you have an excellent case. The bad news is that they seem committed to this course of action, which means we're probably going to end up in court. How much is this going to cost? I'm not going to lie to you, Carter. It could get expensive. But I think we can potentially recover your attorney fees if we win, and I'm very confident we will win. What they're doing isn't just wrong, it's potentially illegal. They're committing what could be considered extortion, making threats they have no legal authority to carry out in order to coerce you into paying fines that are themselves questionable. So, what's the next step? I'm going to draft a cease and desist letter to the HOA board and their attorney, if they actually have one. We're going to lay out very clearly why their actions are illegal and give them one last chance to back down before we file suit. We'll also demand they remove that sticker from your door and cease all harassment immediately. The letter went out that afternoon via certified mail and email. I felt a small sense of relief, like I'd finally done something proactive instead of just reacting to Sharon's increasingly unhinged demands. The relief lasted about 48 hours. On Saturday, exactly 2 weeks after Sharon's initial visit, I woke up to the sound of trucks in my driveway. I stumbled out of bed and looked out the window to see a moving van parked in front of my house, along with Sharon's silver BMW. There were 4 men in matching gray uniforms standing on my lawn, and Sharon was directing them with animated gestures. I threw on clothes and ran outside. "What the hell is going on?" Sharon turned to me with a satisfied smile. As I informed you, Mr. Daniels, the 30-day notice period is not required when the property owner displays hostile and threatening behavior toward HOA representatives. Your actions last week gave the board cause to accelerate the timeline. These gentlemen are here to facilitate your removal from the property. One of the uniformed men stepped forward. He was built like a refrigerator and had a name tag that read Steve. Sir, we're going to need you to step aside while we secure the premises. Secure the premises. This is my house. You can't just throw me out. We have authorization from the Property Management Authority, Steve said, pulling out a document that looked official but probably meant nothing. If you don't comply, we'll have to call the police. Call them, I said. Please call them. I want the police here to see what you're trying to do. Sharon's smile faltered slightly. That won't be necessary. Mr. Daniels, if you'll just cooperate, I'm not cooperating with anything. You have no legal right to be here, no legal right to remove me from my property, and I have an attorney who's made that very clear to you. Your attorney sent us a letter full of threats and bluster, Sharon said, her voice rising. But the fact remains that you are in violation of legally binding HOA regulations, and the board has the authority to take remedial action. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. Sharon's eyes went wide. Yes, I need police at 4782 Desert Willow Drive in Scottsdale, I said when the operator answered. There are people trying to illegally evict me from my home. The operator asked several questions, which I answered while staring directly at Sharon. Her face had gone from triumphant to uncertain. Steve and his crew were looking at each other nervously. Officers are on their way, the operator told me. Please stay on the line until they arrive. I'll be right here, I said, not going anywhere because this is my house. Sharon pulled out her own phone and stepped away, speaking in urgent, hushed tones to someone. The moving crew retreated to their truck. Steve crossed his arms and tried to look intimidating, but he kept glancing at the street like he was hoping for an escape route. 2 Scottsdale police cruisers arrived within 10 minutes. Officers Martinez and Chen got out and surveyed the scene with the weary expressions of people who dealt with HOA disputes before. Someone want to tell me what's going on here? Officer Martinez asked. Sharon jumped in before I could speak. Officer, this man is refusing to vacate property that has been legally seized by the Saguaro Heights Homeowners Association. We're simply here to take possession of the premises pursuant to our bylaws and, Madam, I'm going to stop you right there, Officer Martinez said. Do you have a court order authorizing this eviction? We don't need a court order. The HOA bylaws grant us the authority. That's not how it works, Officer Chen interjected. You need a court order to evict someone from their home, period. I don't care what your bylaws say. But he's violated numerous regulations. He owes thousands in fines. Then you need to pursue that through the legal system, Officer Martinez said. File a lien, sue for the money, go through the foreclosure process if it comes to that. But you cannot show up with a moving truck and force someone out of their home. That's illegal. Sharon looked like she'd been slapped. But our attorney said, then your attorney is wrong, or you misunderstood what they told you. Either way, you and these gentlemen need to leave this property right now. Steve didn't need to be told twice. He and his crew were back in the moving truck before Sharon could finish sputtering her protests. The truck pulled away with obvious relief. This is outrageous, Sharon said, her voice shaking. This man has made a mockery of our community regulations. He's been openly defiant and hostile. Madam, I understand you're frustrated, but you need to handle this through proper legal channels, Officer Chen said firmly. What you attempted to do here today is illegal. If you try it again, you could face criminal charges. That seemed to finally penetrate. Sharon's mouth opened and closed a few times, but no sound came out. She looked at me with pure hatred in her eyes. "This isn't over," she said. "You're right," I replied, "because now I'm definitely suing you." She got in her BMW and drove away fast enough to leave skid marks. The officers took my statement and a report, and Officer Martinez gave me the case number. "Do yourself a favor," he said. "Get a security camera system. HOA disputes can get nasty, and you want documentation of everything." Already on my list. After they left, I stood in my driveway for a long time, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. This had gone from annoying to absurd to actually frightening. Sharon and her board weren't just overzealous busybodies anymore. They were actively trying to steal my house, and they didn't seem to care about little things like laws or reality. I called Rachel and told her what happened. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. "Carter, we need to file suit immediately. Like Monday morning." What they just did crosses a line. We're not just talking about HOA overreach anymore. They attempted an illegal eviction. That's actionable, and frankly, I think we should consider filing a criminal complaint as well. Criminal. What they did could potentially fall under extortion statutes. They made threats to take property they have no legal right to, backed by what could be considered intimidation tactics. I want to talk to the DA's office about it. My head was spinning. This has gotten completely out of control. Yes, it has, which is why we need to shut it down hard and fast. "Can you come to my office Monday morning at 8? I want to have the complaint drafted and filed before noon." I agreed and spent the rest of the weekend installing security cameras. I put one covering the front door, one on the driveway, one on the side gate, and one covering the backyard. I also changed the locks on all my gates and added padlocks for good measure. If Sharon or her minions wanted to trespass again, they were going to have a harder time of it. Monday morning, I was at Rachel's office at 7:45. She had coffee ready and a draft complaint that was 23 pages long. We went through it line by line, making adjustments and adding details. At 11:30, we walked to the Maricopa County Superior Court building and filed the lawsuit. Carter Daniels v. Saguaro Heights Homeowners Association, Sharon Pritchard, Linda Weatherby, and George Hamilton. The complaint alleged breach of contract, violation of Arizona HOA statutes, attempted illegal eviction, harassment, and sought both compensatory and punitive damages plus attorney fees. Rachel had also included a request for an emergency temporary restraining order prohibiting the HOA from any further enforcement actions against me while the case was pending. "Now we wait," Rachel said as we left the courthouse. "The TRO hearing is scheduled for Wednesday. In the meantime, do not engage with any of them. If they contact you, refer them to me." They didn't wait long. That evening, I got an email from someone named Patricia Hughes, identifying herself as the HOA's attorney. The email was polite but firm, stating that the HOA denied all allegations in my complaint and looked forward to defending their actions in court. She also noted that the HOA would be filing a counterclaim for unpaid fines and assessments. I forwarded it to Rachel without responding. The TRO hearing on Wednesday was my first time in a courtroom outside of jury duty. Judge Catherine Brennan presided, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and an expression that suggested she'd heard every possible excuse and wasn't impressed by any of them. Rachel presented our case, walking through the timeline of events from Sharon's initial seizure threat to the attempted eviction. She showed the judge photos of the orange sticker on my door, copies of all the violation notices, and the police report from Saturday's incident. Patricia Hughes, the HOA's attorney, tried to argue that the HOA had been acting within its authority and that the moving truck had been a miscommunication rather than an attempted illegal eviction. Let me make sure I understand your position, Miss Hughes, Judge Brennan said, peering over her reading glasses. Your client sent Mr. Daniels a written notice claiming they were seizing his property. Then, 2 weeks later, your client showed up with a moving truck and attempted to remove him from his home. But you're saying this was a miscommunication. Your Honor, the board members were attempting to conduct a property inspection, and the moving company was hired to assist with the removal of items that were in violation of HOA regulations, such as— I'm sorry, Your Honor. What items were they planning to remove? The bird feeder, some decorative rocks, perhaps Mr. Daniels himself, since you seem to think he's in violation of existing. A few people in the courtroom gallery chuckled. Patricia's face reddened. Your Honor, the HOA takes its obligations to maintain community standards very seriously. I'm sure they do, Miss Hughes, but what they don't take seriously, apparently, is the law. Unless you can show me specific statutory authority granting HOAs the power to seize property and evict homeowners without a court order, I'm going to grant this TRO. Patricia shuffled through her papers. Your Honor, the CC and Articles contain provisions for remedial action in cases of ongoing violations. Do those provisions include the words seize property or evict homeowner? Not in those exact words, but then I've heard enough. The temporary restraining order is granted. The defendants are prohibited from taking any enforcement action against Mr. Daniels or his property pending resolution of this case. That includes violation notices, fines, inspections, or any other contact beyond what is absolutely necessary for normal HOA business. Miss Hughes, I suggest you have a serious conversation with your clients about the difference between HOA authority and vigilante justice. We're adjourned. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Rachel squeezed my shoulder. That went well, she whispered. As we left the courtroom, I saw Sharon, Linda, and George standing with Patricia in the hallway. Sharon looked furious. Our eyes met for a moment, and I saw something in her expression that worried me. She didn't look chastened or embarrassed. She looked defiant. Over the next 2 weeks, there was an uneasy quiet. Sharon didn't contact me. I didn't get any violation notices. The orange sticker remained on my door because Rachel wanted it preserved as evidence, but otherwise it felt almost normal. Then I started hearing from my neighbors. It started with Tom Henderson, who lived 2 houses down. He knocked on my door on a Saturday afternoon, looking uncomfortable. "Hey, Carter, you got a minute?" "Sure, come on in." We sat in my living room, and Tom fidgeted with his baseball cap. "Look, I don't know how to say this, so I'm just going to say it. Sharon's been going around the neighborhood talking about you, telling people you're suing the HOA and it's going to cost everyone money because our dues are going to have to go up to cover legal fees. That's not how it works. If I win, they'll have to pay my attorney fees, and regardless, they're the ones who created this mess. I know, man. I'm on your side. That whole thing with your fence was crazy. I'm the one who approved it, and then Sharon and Linda went over my head and reversed it without even telling me. But not everyone sees it that way. Some people are pretty mad at you. Mad at me. I'm the victim here, I know, but Sharon's spinning it like you're some kind of troublemaker who just doesn't want to follow the rules, and now you're costing everyone money. She's good at that, making herself sound reasonable. I rubbed my face. Great. That's just great. There's something else. There's going to be a special HOA meeting next week. Sharon's calling it to discuss the lawsuit and vote on a special assessment to cover legal fees. Can she do that? According to the bylaws, yeah. The board can call a special meeting with 7 days' notice for any matter of urgent community business. I called Rachel immediately after Tom left. She wasn't surprised. This is pretty standard HOA warfare. They're going to try to turn your neighbors against you, make you the bad guy. The special assessment is legal if they follow proper procedures. But here's the thing. If we win the lawsuit, which I'm confident we will, the HOA might be able to recover those legal fees from the individual board members who acted improperly. You mean Sharon, Linda, and George? Exactly. They acted outside the scope of their authority and potentially exposed the HOA to significant liability. The association's insurance probably won't cover it because it was an intentional act. So if the HOA has to pay damages and attorney fees, they could potentially sue the board members personally to recover those costs. Do Sharon and the others know that? If Patricia's doing her job, she's told them. But people like Sharon often don't believe bad things will actually happen to them. They think they can bully and intimidate their way through anything. The special HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 7 p.m. in the community center. I wasn't sure I wanted to go, but Rachel thought it was important. You need to be there to defend yourself if they start making accusations. Plus, it'll be interesting to see what they say. Just don't lose your temper, no matter what happens. The community center was packed when I arrived. There were at least 70 people crammed into a space meant for 50. I recognized most of them as neighbors I'd waved to in passing but never really talked to. The atmosphere was tense. Sharon stood at the front of the room behind a folding table, flanked by Linda and George. She was wearing a navy blue suit that looked almost presidential, her hair in a severe bun that pulled her features tight. She saw me enter and her expression hardened. "Ladies and gentlemen, if we could all take our seats, we'll begin," she announced. The crowd settled into chairs or stood along the walls. I found a spot near the back, trying to be inconspicuous. Sharon launched into her presentation without preamble. Thank you all for coming on short notice. As most of you are aware, the HOA is currently facing a lawsuit from one of our residents, Mr. Carter Daniels. She gestured in my direction, and heads turned to look at me. Mr. Daniels has decided that the rules that apply to everyone else in this community don't apply to him. When the board attempted to enforce our regulations that we all agreed to when we purchased our homes, Mr. Daniels responded with hostility, threats, and ultimately, litigation. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people were nodding along with Sharon's words. The legal fees associated with defending against this frivolous lawsuit are substantial. Our attorney estimates that it will cost the association at least $50,000, possibly more, to mount an adequate defense. These are funds that should be going toward community improvements, landscape maintenance, and amenities. Instead, they're being wasted because one person refuses to follow the rules. That's not what happened, I said, unable to stop myself despite Rachel's warning. Sharon's eyes locked on mine. Mr. Daniels, you'll have a chance to speak during the comment period. No, I'm speaking now. You're lying to these people. You didn't try to enforce regulations. You tried to steal my house. The room erupted. People were talking over each other, some calling for order, others demanding to know what I meant. Sharon banged a gavel on the table. "Order, we will have order." An older man in the third row stood up. "I want to hear what Carter has to say. Sharon, you've given your side. Let him speak." Others voiced agreement. Sharon looked like she wanted to refuse, but the room was clearly not on her side in this particular moment. "Fine," she said icily. "Mr. Daniels, you have 3 minutes." I stood up, my heart pounding. Sharon came to my house and told me the HOA was seizing my property. She gave me a written notice saying I had 30 days to vacate. When I told her that wasn't legal, she didn't back down. 2 weeks later, she showed up with a moving truck and tried to forcibly evict me from my home. The police had to be called. They told her what she was doing was illegal and she could face criminal charges if she tried it again. Another murmur, louder this time. People were looking at Sharon with different expressions now, skeptical and concerned. That is a gross mischaracterization. Sharon said, "The board was attempting to conduct a necessary property inspection with a moving truck," someone called out. "And why were you trying to seize his property in the first place?" Another voice added. Sharon's face was turning red. "Mr. Daniels has accumulated over $8,000 in fines for violations, for having rocks that were 2 inches too big," I interrupted. "For using the wrong brand of paint, for having a bird feeder." "Sharon has been harassing me since the day I moved in, making up violations for things that aren't actually violations, contradicting herself, and making my life hell. All I did was defend myself when she tried to illegally take my house. If anyone's costing this HOA money, it's her, not me." Tom Henderson stood up. "I was on the architectural committee when Carter put up his fence. We approved it. Sharon and Linda reversed the approval without telling the committee and then fined Carter for it. That's not right." Linda jumped to her feet. "The approval process wasn't properly followed." "Yes, it was," Tom shot back. "I've been on that committee for 6 years. I know the process. Carter followed every rule. You reversed it because Sharon doesn't like him." The meeting devolved into chaos. People were arguing with each other, with Sharon, demanding to see documentation of my violations, asking why the board had tried to seize property without a court order. George looked miserable, like he wanted to be anywhere else. Linda kept trying to defend their actions, but she was drowned out by angry voices. Finally, a woman in her 70s stood up and shouted for quiet in a voice that could have stopped a charging bull. The room fell silent. "My name is Dorothy Chen," she said. "I've lived in this community for 22 years, longer than anyone else here. I've seen 5 different HOA boards, and I have to say, this current board is the worst I've ever encountered. Sharon, what you've described sounds nothing like the reasonable enforcement of community standards. It sounds like harassment and abuse of power. I don't know Carter well, but I do know that HOAs exist to maintain property values and community harmony, not to make residents' lives miserable over paint brands and bird feeders." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen," Sharon said through clenched teeth. "But the fact remains that we have expenses you created," Dorothy interrupted. "If what Carter says is true, and I believe it is, then you brought this lawsuit on yourselves. I'm not voting for any special assessment to fund a defense of your illegal actions. I'm voting to remove you from the board." The room erupted in applause. Sharon looked stunned. Linda grabbed her arm, whispering urgently. George had his head in his hands. "There's no motion on the floor for a board recall," Sharon said weakly. "Then I'm making one," Dorothy said. "I move that we hold an immediate vote to recall the current board members and elect an interim board to manage the association's affairs pending new elections." "I second that motion," Tom said immediately. Sharon tried to regain control, but it was too late. The room was against her. Someone else made a motion to table the discussion of the special assessment, which passed overwhelmingly. Then the recall vote happened, and it wasn't even close. Of the 68 homeowners present, 54 voted to recall the board. Sharon's face had gone from red to white. She gathered her papers with shaking hands while Linda whispered something that sounded like legal threats. George just sat there, looking resigned. "This is not over," Sharon said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You're all making a terrible mistake." She swept out of the community center with Linda trailing behind her. George stayed long enough to hand over the HOA's financial records and keys to Dorothy, who'd been elected interim president by acclamation. After the meeting, several neighbors came up to apologize for believing Sharon's version of events. Tom clapped me on the shoulder. "That was intense," he said, "but it needed to happen. Sharon's been running this HOA like her personal fiefdom for too long." Dorothy approached with a warm smile. "Carter, I'm so sorry you've had to deal with this nonsense. One of the interim board's first priorities will be to review all the fines and violations you've been assessed. I suspect most of them will be dismissed." "I appreciate that, Mrs. Chen, but there's still the lawsuit." "About that. Would you be willing to meet with the new board to discuss a potential settlement? I think we can probably resolve this without continuing the litigation, if you're amenable." I said I'd talk to my attorney. Rachel, when I called her that night, was pleased but cautious. "This is good, but don't drop your guard. Sharon and the others are still technically defendants in the lawsuit. Even if the HOA settles with you, they could try to continue fighting individually. Plus, we still need to address the potential criminal aspects of what they did." That became relevant sooner than expected. 2 days after the recall vote, I got a call from Detective Sarah Yoshida with the Scottsdale Police Department. She wanted to meet with me about my complaint regarding the attempted illegal eviction. We met at a coffee shop near Old Town Scottsdale. Detective Yoshida was in her 40s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a directness I appreciated. "I've reviewed your case file and the police report from the incident," she said. "I've also spoken with Officer Martinez and your attorney. What Mrs. Pritchard and the HOA board attempted to do appears to meet the criteria for several potential criminal charges, including extortion and criminal trespass." My heart rate picked up. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm opening a formal investigation. I'll need to interview the board members, the moving company employees, and anyone else who was involved. I'll also need you to provide a formal statement and any additional documentation you have." "They've been recalled from the HOA board. Does that matter?" "Not from a criminal perspective. If they committed crimes, the fact that they're no longer in positions of authority is irrelevant." She paused, stirring her coffee. "I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Daniels. Cases like this can be hard to prosecute because defense attorneys argue that the defendants genuinely believed they had authority to act. But the egregious nature of what happened here, combined with the fact that they were warned it was illegal and continued anyway, gives us a strong case." Over the next 3 weeks, Detective Yoshida conducted her investigation. She interviewed Sharon, Linda, and George separately. She talked to Steve from the moving company, who apparently was very cooperative and quite angry that he'd been lied to about having proper authorization. She reviewed all my documentation, the police reports, and even interviewed the judge who'd granted the TRO. Meanwhile, the interim HOA board and I worked out a settlement. They agreed to dismiss all fines and violations, pay my attorney fees of $18,000, and issue a formal apology. In exchange, I agreed to drop the lawsuit against the HOA itself, though not against Sharon, Linda, and George personally. Rachel advised me that going after them individually would be difficult and expensive, but I wanted to reserve the right to do so if they caused any more problems. Sharon did, in fact, cause more problems. She refused to cooperate with Detective Yoshida's investigation, claiming harassment. She hired her own attorney, some expensive Phoenix lawyer who specialized in white-collar criminal defense. She also started posting on neighborhood social media about how she was the real victim, being persecuted for trying to maintain community standards. Most people didn't buy it. The new interim board had released a statement summarizing what had happened, carefully worded to avoid defamation, but clear enough that anyone reading it would understand. Sharon had grossly overstepped her authority. Several other residents came forward with their own stories of Sharon's harassment and abuse of power, including one couple who'd nearly sold their house just to get away from her constant violation notices. On May 15th, almost 3 months after Sharon had first marched up my driveway with her manila folder, Detective Yashida called me. "I wanted to let you know that we're filing charges. Sharon Pritchard is being charged with attempted extortion and criminal trespass. Linda Weatherby and George Hamilton are being charged as accessories. The DA believes we have a strong case." I didn't know how to feel. Part of me was relieved that there would be consequences. Part of me felt bad for George, who seemed like he'd just been going along with Sharon's madness without really understanding the implications. But mostly, I just felt exhausted. The arraignment was scheduled for early June. I didn't attend, but Rachel did, and she called me afterward with an update. Sharon pled not guilty, and her attorney made some noise about pursuing this being a waste of resources. Linda and George both took plea deals. They're each getting 6 months probation and community service, plus they have to pay restitution toward the HOA's legal fees. Sharon's going to trial. When? Probably not until fall, given the court's calendar. But Carter, the DA, is taking this seriously. They think they can get a conviction. The trial was set for October 3rd. In the months leading up to it, I tried to move on with my life. I focused on work, took on a couple of new projects, even started dating someone I'd met through a client. The HOA elected a permanent new board that was refreshingly sane. They actually followed the rules instead of making up new ones to punish people they didn't like. Sharon's attorney tried multiple times to get the case dismissed, arguing that it was a civil matter that shouldn't be in criminal court. Judge Peter Sullivan, who was presiding over the trial, wasn't having it. The defendant's alleged actions go beyond a mere contract dispute, he said during one pre-trial hearing I attended. "If the state's allegations are true, Miss Pritchard attempted to use threats and intimidation to force the victim to surrender his property, knowing she had no legal authority to take such actions. That's extortion, regardless of whether there was also a civil component to the dispute." The trial lasted 4 days. The prosecution called me as their first witness. I spent 3 hours on the stand, walking through the entire timeline of events. Sharon's attorney, a polished man named Richard Kemp, tried to paint me as a difficult homeowner who'd refused to follow reasonable rules, but the prosecution had done their homework. They had all the violation notices, showing how petty and contradictory they were. They had the police report. They had testimony from Officer Martinez about Sharon's behavior during the attempted eviction. They even had testimony from Tom Henderson about how the architectural committee's approval for my fence had been improperly reversed. Steve from the moving company testified that Sharon had told him she had full legal authority to evict me, and that the police had approved the action. When he'd asked to see the court order, she'd told him it wasn't necessary for HOA evictions. He'd believed her because she seemed really official and sure of herself. Detective Yashida testified about her investigation and the evidence she'd gathered. The prosecution played the 911 call I'd made, and you could hear Sharon in the background insisting she had the right to be there. Sharon testified in her own defense, and it did not go well. She was combative with the prosecutor, insisting repeatedly that she'd been acting within her authority as HOA president. When the prosecutor asked her to cite the specific Arizona statute that gave HOAs the power to seize property without a court order, she couldn't do it. The bylaws grant the board remedial authority, she kept saying, but not the authority to evict homeowners without a court order, correct? The prosecutor pressed. We weren't evicting him. We were taking possession of the property to bring it into compliance. By removing Mr. Daniels from his home with a moving truck, he was given notice. He chose not to comply, because what you were demanding was illegal. I don't agree with that characterization. On and on it went. Richard Kemp did his best to rehabilitate her on redirect, but the damage was done. In her closing argument, the prosecutor was blunt. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about abuse of power. Sharon Pritchard believed that her position as HOA president gave her authority she didn't have. When Mr. Daniels dared to question her, she retaliated by threatening to take his home. When he didn't back down, she actually attempted to follow through on that threat, showing up with a moving company to forcibly remove him. She did this knowing, or with willful disregard for the fact, that she had no legal right to do so. That's extortion. That's criminal trespass. And that deserves punishment. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours. They found Sharon guilty on both counts. Sentencing was 3 weeks later. I attended, sitting in the back of the courtroom. Sharon looked smaller somehow, deflated. Richard Kemp made an impassioned plea for leniency, talking about Sharon's otherwise clean record, her volunteer work in the community, the stress she'd been under managing the HOA. The prosecutor recommended a sentence of 90 days in county jail, followed by 3 years of probation. Judge Sullivan considered for a long moment before speaking. Miss Pritchard, I've presided over a lot of cases in my 20 years on the bench. What troubles me most about this one is your continued refusal to acknowledge the seriousness of what you did. Even during trial, you maintained that you were acting properly. That level of delusion or arrogance, I'm not sure which, is deeply concerning. He sentenced her to 45 days in county jail, followed by 2 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution of $25,000 to cover my attorney fees and related costs, forbidden from serving on any HOA board during her probation, and required to complete 100 hours of community service. Sharon's face crumpled as the sentence was read. She was led away by bailiffs, and that was the last I saw of her. Afterward, outside the courthouse, Rachel and I stood in the afternoon sunshine. How do you feel? She asked. Weird, I admitted. I'm glad it's over. I'm glad there were consequences, but I don't feel good about any of it. This whole thing was so stupid and unnecessary. That's usually how these things go. People let power go to their heads, they make bad decisions, and everyone suffers for it. I went home to my house, the house that Sharon had tried to take from me, and sat on my front porch with a beer. The neighborhood was quiet. My grass was exactly the height it was supposed to be, though I'd stopped caring quite as much about that. My bird feeder was still hanging from the maple tree, with 3 sparrows and a cardinal fighting over the seeds. Tom Henderson walked by with his dog and waved. Mrs. Chen drove past in her old Buick and honked. Normal neighborhood stuff, the way it should have been from the beginning. I thought about everything that had happened, from that Saturday morning when Sharon had marched up my driveway to the courtroom where she'd been sentenced. All of it because she'd convinced herself that being HOA president gave her powers she didn't have, and because she couldn't stand someone questioning her authority. The new HOA board was doing fine. They'd settled into a reasonable rhythm of actually maintaining the community without terrorizing residents. They'd even apologized to several other homeowners who'd been on the receiving end of Sharon's reign of terror and dismissed a bunch of questionable fines. Linda and George had completed their plea agreements and mostly stayed out of sight. I'd heard through the neighborhood grapevine that George had moved to Tucson to be closer to his daughter. Linda was still around but kept to herself. As for me, I finished several major projects that summer and fall. Business was good. I'd even started volunteering with a local organization that helped homeowners fight HOA overreach, sharing my story as a cautionary tale and connecting people with resources. My girlfriend, Amy, moved in that December. She thought the whole HOA saga was insane but admired how I'd stood up for myself. We spent Christmas decorating the house with lights that were absolutely within HOA regulations. Thank you very much, though I'd stopped caring quite as much about that kind of thing. On New Year's Eve, sitting on that same front porch with Amy, watching neighbors set off fireworks in the desert distance, I reflected on the year. It had been stressful, expensive, and occasionally scary. But I'd learned something important. Institutions like HOAs only have the power people give them. When Sharon had tried to take my house, she'd been counting on me being too intimidated or too ignorant to fight back. She'd counted wrong. The justice system, for all its flaws, had worked. The law had been on my side. The community had ultimately seen through Sharon's manipulation, and consequences had been delivered to someone who'd badly abused the small amount of power she'd been given. Amy squeezed my hand as midnight approached. "Any New Year's resolutions?" she asked. I thought about it. "Yeah, never serve on an HOA board," she laughed, and we kissed as fireworks exploded overhead, celebrating the end of a year I was more than ready to leave behind and the beginning of one that would hopefully be much less eventful. The house that Sharon Pritchard had threatened to seize remained mine. The bird feeder stayed up. The rocks in my front yard, 2 inches over the maximum allowable size, continued to exist peacefully. And somewhere in Maricopa County Jail, then later in her own home on probation, Sharon hopefully learned that HOA president was not, in fact, a position that granted dictatorial powers or immunity from the law. It was a lesson that had cost her 45 days of freedom, $25,000, her reputation in the community, and her position on the board she'd treated like a throne. It was a lesson I wished she'd learned before attempting to steal my house, but at least she'd learned it. And maybe, just maybe, the next HOA president in the next community would hear this story and think twice before threatening a homeowner with illegal seizure of property. Maybe they'd remember Sharon Pritchard and what happened when someone with a little authority decided the law didn't apply to them. Or maybe they wouldn't. People have short memories and power is intoxicating, but that was someone else's problem now. Mine had been resolved, legally and properly, exactly as it should have been from the start. My property was mine. My rights had been vindicated. And Sharon's threats, which had once seemed so official and frightening, had been revealed for what they really were. The empty bluster of someone who'd confused an HOA presidency with actual legal authority. In the end, that was the story I told when people asked about the HOA situation. Not a story about victory or revenge, but a story about standing up to bullies, even when they've wrapped themselves in the language of rules and bylaws and community standards. A story about how the system, when pushed, actually worked the way it was supposed to. And a story about how important it is to know your rights and defend them, even when someone with a title and a clipboard tries to convince you they have powers they absolutely do not possess. The orange sticker had finally been removed from my front door, preserved as evidence during the trial and no longer needed. The violation notices had all been dismissed. The fines had been erased. And I was just another homeowner in Scottsdale, Arizona, living in a neighborhood with a functional HOA that actually served its proper purpose. That was all I'd ever wanted. It was all any reasonable homeowner wanted. And it was exactly what Sharon Pritchard had nearly destroyed in her quest for control and compliance. But nearly wasn't the same as actually, and my house remained mine, a testament to the simple truth that in America, you still couldn't just seize someone's property because you didn't like their bird feeder. That seemed like it should have been obvious from the start. But then again, if it had been, I wouldn't have spent 8 months fighting an HOA president who'd convinced herself she was above the law. Sometimes the most obvious truths are the ones people most need to be reminded of, usually the hard way. Sharon Pritchard had learned that truth the hardest way possible. And I defended mine the only way that mattered, by standing my ground, knowing my rights, and refusing to be bullied out of my own home by someone whose authority existed only in her own mind.